Well, good afternoon, everyone. We've got folks filtering into the room. We'll wait just a few minutes before we officially get started. But as usual, for those of you who have attended some of our previous virtual lunchtime expeditions, we encourage you to let us know where you're joining us from. Today, we've got a little bit of a different option to do that. We've created a poll for you to let us know if you're from Wyoming, from outside Wyoming, but still in the West, outside the West, but in the US, and outside of the US. And this option is going to help us as we begin to talk about water and Wyoming today with our guest speaker. So you can also, once you've responded to the poll, feel free to, in the chat, let us know exactly where you're joining us from. We always enjoy seeing that. So again, we'll wait just a few moments as we let folks come in, and we'll get started shortly. Excellent. Sue is joining us from down in Pinedale. Barbara is up in Red Lodge. Again, for those of you just coming into the room and joining us for today's lunchtime expedition, as always, we like to know where everybody's joining us from. You'll notice, hopefully on your screen, you have a poll option to let us know kind of what geographic area you're from. And this will help our speaker today as she explores water in Wyoming and the West. But once you've submitted that poll, feel free, as some folks have done, to put in chat where you're joining us from. Doreen is joining us from up in Alberta, Canada. Justin is joining us from down in Lander. Jeff up in Red Lodge. Jessica from Albuquerque. Excellent. Thanks everybody for joining us. Longmont, Colorado. We'll give folks just a few more minutes to come into the room before we officially kick it off. Okay, it looks like attendee admittance has slowed down just a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and kick it off. If you haven't had a chance yet to respond to that poll that's showing up on your screen to let us know where you're geographically from, that would be wonderful. We'll go ahead and tally the results to give our speaker today, Ann MacKinnon, an idea of where folks are joining us from. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Dorr, and I'm the curator of the Draper Natural History Museum here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody. Our assistant curator, Corey Anko, is joining us on the back end of technology today and making sure things run as they need to. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's virtual lunchtime expedition. We're happy to have you joining us, and especially happy to have today's speaker. Support for the Draper's Lunchtime Expedition series has been made possible by the Sage Creek Ranch and the Nancy Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation. These sponsors help us make these programs possible, but we're also grateful to you, everyone in our audience, for your attendance, your feedback, and your support. As a reminder, for those of you who may not have joined us before, we do record our lunchtime expeditions and we post them to the Draper's YouTube channel. So if you've missed any of our previous speakers or you want to repeat view today's presentation, you can find them there. Just go to your favorite search engine and search for Draper Natural History Museum YouTube, and you'll find us. In addition to those of you joining us via the Zoom webinar today, we are also broadcasting our presentation over on Facebook Live. So please, wherever you're joining us from, feel free to submit your questions using Zoom's chat or Q&A feature, or if you're over there on Facebook Live, use the comment feature and we'll moderate all of those. We'll relay your questions to our speaker at the end of the presentation. So today we are joined by MacKinnon. Anne is a longtime Wyoming journalist with a background in both natural resource economics as well as law. She is a former editor-in-chief of the statewide newspaper, a former chair of the Wyoming Water Development Commission, and former board chair of WyoFile.com, Wyoming's online in-depth news source. She is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Wyoming and a consultant in public discussion of natural resource issues. A special note about today's presentation, Anne will be speaking about her recently published book, Public Waters: Lessons from Wyoming for the American West. Copies of that book are available from the center's Point West Market, and you can order your copy by phone by calling 1-800-533-3838. And if you'd like a signed copy, just let them know. Now, before I turn it over to Anne, I want to share some results of our poll. So, Anne, we've got about 56% of our audience today joining us from here in Wyoming, about 33% joining us from outside Wyoming, but still in the West, 6% from outside the West, but in the US, and 6% outside of the US. So now, without any further delay, please welcome our August lunchtime expedition speaker, Anne MacKinnon.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I think that we have such a nice small group that if you see a question that seems relevant to something I'm just discussing, I think you ought to interrupt me and bring that question in, because it'll make everything flow better. I love to be able to have sort of a discussion with the audience, and I think we have a pretty nice small group to do that with. So this book that I just published is the result of about 25 years of research as I attended water meetings and delved around in old archives. I'm now trying to make this work. Let's see. Okay, yes. So one of the things, and since most of you are from the West, you already know how different our landscape and our place is from places further east, where many of the people who came here in the late 1800s and created the water law we live with and around now, where they came from. And this was also true for me. So that's what 1979 is doing here. I showed up here in 1979, having come from growing up in Kentucky along the Ohio River and ending up here. And one of the things that I think is obvious to us all is that water is particularly precious in a dry place. It connects people in place as a result, and it also connects people who might rather not know each other, but they have to, because the water creates an interdependence among people when you're living in a place like this. And water law, therefore, really reflects people's experience in that particular place that they're in, so that water law in Wyoming is a little different from water law in other parts of the West. And that's, to me, what makes it fascinating. And one of the things that really struck me that I wanted to explore, and then as I explored it, then I wanted to express for other people, is how much our water law which reflects what people in Wyoming experienced, how much that has changed over time, and therefore that it will continue to change. It has to change to accommodate changing needs of our society and economy. Sometimes people, particularly in Wyoming, and this is probably true in other states, because our water law has worked relatively well for a number of people, they tend to regard it as possibly written in stone and handed down through the ages, and therefore unchanging. And that's one of the things that I think it's really important for people to realize, that that's not the case, that one of the strengths of Wyoming's water law has been that it has changed with experience over time. This place that we're in, I think most of you already know. Excuse me, I forgot to change these. These are in hectares because I was giving a presentation to people in Europe. But you know, it's a big place, not a lot of people, high altitude. Streams are mostly snow-fed. Most of the ag lands really are grazing. There are some irrigable ag lands, but those amount to about 3% of the surface. But the surface water that we use, and a lot of water runs out of Wyoming unused because we're headwaters for major rivers. But of what we use, 73% of that, of the surface water, is used for irrigation, for ag. And a lot of those crops are forage. And the people, as of recent years, who are tending to use that are a small number, less than 2% of the population. So I just wanted to emphasize that you know, the irrigated lands are not all that many, and of the surface water we use in this state, a lot of it goes to ag, and it's a small number of people. So that has a lot to do with how our water law was shaped. Now, for me, the reason I got interested, I came here as a reporter for the statewide paper, the Casper Star Tribune, which was more statewide at that point than it is now. And I was actually covering energy stuff, oil and gas, but they were like, well, natural resources, water, yeah, why don't you cover this too? And in 1986, the state of Nebraska sued Wyoming over the North Platte River. This is a picture of the North Platte before it was dammed in 1904. But it was clear that hundreds of millions of dollars were going to be spent on litigation over this river. Here's another view of the Platte. Oops, excuse me. I don't know if I can go back. Well, anyway, to me, that, I don't know if well, I'm not going to try to go back. Anyway, that river, which runs through Casper, so I was familiar with it, is what we would have called a creek in Kentucky. So I was pretty interested in why and what is this all about. At the same time, I was covering the legislature, and the House Agricultural Committee of the state legislature, which normally a kind of obstreperous bunch, still is, were extremely deferential to the state engineer when he came asking for certain changes in the law, nothing to do with this litigation, something else. So I just was like, okay, what is this? What is a state engineer? What's going on? So I went to see the state engineer, who at the time was George Christopoulos. There had been a strain of Greek settlers in Wyoming, and George came from a Greek family. He was a wonderful guy. And he was smart enough to give me beautiful old books bound in calf leather, written by Elwood Mead, who was one of the key founder of Wyoming Water Law. And so you give a stack of books like that to a reporter, and, you know, she goes off. She doesn't come back to bother you for a while. I tried to learn more about Wyoming water law, and of course, there were people here for thousands of years who did not use land or water as heavily as the European origin settlers who came here in the late 19th century. So what those people who came, again, most of them from places like where I came from, to a place like this, and had some of them came to run herds of cattle and sheep, and that was particularly in the early years from the 1860s on into the 1880s. but others of them came to try to homestead with the Homestead Act that was passed during the Civil War. And they had really no idea of what kind of climate, altitude, general terrain that they were coming into. They had a lot to learn when they got here. They developed the kinds of rules that were developed all over the West by these same people, which we call the priority system, the prior appropriation system, with the idea that whoever got there first should have the best rights. And this is a lot to do with, well, yeah, it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get here and establish, use that water. And so that person should have the best rights, so that in time of drought, literally, or water shortage, maybe it's in however you want to call it, the person with that early priority right has a right to all the water that their right covers before anybody else, sometimes of a later, who has a later date right. They also, the feeling of these people who came here was also that, however, if there's big emphasis on use, if you don't keep using that water right, you should lose it because other people have come after you who need it. So in Wyoming, that was, after a while, the territorial legislature said, oh, well, you know, maybe you should post a notice on a tree near the creek or somewhere that nearby that says, well, I took this water and here's how much I take and here's the date, so this is my right. And after that, several years later, they got to the point where they said, yeah, well, maybe you should register that claim in the county courthouse. But if you've ever seen a map of the counties in Wyoming at that time, this is in the 1880s, they were big. Some ran all the way from Montana to Colorado. So the county courthouse was not necessarily very close by. The terrible harsh winter of and drought summer of 86, 87 made people, including the great stockmen who were running cattle and sheep here, realize that they might have to actually grow some feed because the Chinook winds that normally made it possible for those herds to find feed all winter long, natural feed, that hadn't worked, and there had been a lot of death, major herds wiped out. And so they were like, so maybe we got to raise some fodder for these herds. And then the settlers coming in under the Homestead Act also wanted to raise crops, and they needed water for that. So the feeling that there had to be a system, and particularly the large stockmen were thinking there really needed to be a system to establish and guard the water rights that they in particular wanted to hold. They brought in a young man who grew up actually not that far from where I grew up on the Ohio River, a young engineer, Elwood Mead, who had worked, his first job as an engineer was in Colorado, and he got a sense of the importance of water in a dry area, but he felt it wasn't very well managed in Colorado, and he tried to push for some reforms there, wasn't successful. So he was pretty eager to come to Wyoming because he saw it as kind of a blank slate where he could try to create new water law. And he was very successful in persuading the legislators and the people in the Constitutional Convention to follow his ideas. And what he talked about, what got into the Constitution in 1890, a lot of state constitutions talk about how, oh, the water belongs to the state, but it didn't mean a whole lot, he had found, for instance, in Colorado. So he wanted some really active state ownership where only the state could authorize private use. And that it was important to get it into water into private hands so that the society could be built and an economy, but that the state would have to approve that. So there would be state approval, including inspections of claims that had been filed before. It could only be, water could only be used for a beneficial purpose, and that was part of the inspection. If you were starting with statehood, trying to claim a new water right, then you had to apply, you had to fill out a permit application, you had to, the state engineer and his staff had to believe that what you were proposing to do was feasible, that the size of the ditch would possibly serve the acreage you were talking about irrigating. These were all mostly irrigation permits. And in those permits, they put time limits for achieving that use. And Meade also, with the superintendents he established there were 4 superintendents of the 4 major basins in the state, that they would limit any transfers to a new use, because he felt really strongly, having seen irrigation companies in Colorado, which would charge people not only for the maintenance and operation of their system, but also for the water itself, because the companies would claim the water. Meade felt very strongly that the water should belong to the people who put it on the ground, and it should be attached to that land in a way that you couldn't really move it off there without losing the priority. And that got ensconced in Wyoming water law. So the Meade system was approved. Interestingly enough, the case that the Wyoming Supreme Court approved the system in a case where it had been fought by a company in Buffalo who was shocked at the idea that they could be, their old right that they had claimed could be inspected by some state authority. This was a taking of private property rights. And you might have thought that in Buffalo there would be those kinds of objections, although this company was actually from Fort Collins. But because the Johnson County War occurred in 1892 with Texas riflemen hired by some of the stock growers to come wipe out some people that they regarded as rustlers, other people described as settlers, and there's always been a lot of controversy about what really, who was who in the Johnson County War. But the people of Buffalo united to stop that invasion. And Meade was closely allied with the major stock growers. So you would have thought that his system would not necessarily be welcomed in the northern part of the state. But what happened was he had one superintendent, unfortunately, actually joined the invaders in the Johnson County War, the superintendent for that area. So he had to get another guy who was actually quite a popular guy. He'd been a surveyor for the railroad, and that guy did an adjudication, did the inspections, and as happened with a lot of the inspections of pre-statehood rights all over the state, when he inspected for actual use, he ended up cutting back the claims to about half of what people had claimed. Meade himself, when he first went around and looked at the county records in 1888 and 89, had commented, he said, you know, the virtue of self-denial has not been conspicuous among these early claimants. And so that's why he thought it was really important to have this inspection system to see what people were actually using and to cut their rights to that, so that people wouldn't be claiming water that they may eventually put to use someday using their early date right under the prior appropriation system. And the new superintendent found that there was some pretty dry years after his adjudication, and he found people accepted the system because they realized that not only they had been cut back to what they actually used, but so were their neighbors, and that they would not have been able to survive if their neighbor, who had a slightly earlier date right, had attempted to use everything under his right rather than what he had actually used in previous years. So the system did get accepted. It was supported by the state Supreme Court. But some changes inevitably began to occur as people tried to deal with this landscape. And where the Draper is situated in Cody was one of the places, the Bighorn Basin, that proved itself quite difficult. If you can imagine trying to get water out of the Shoshone River up onto these flats and make these areas level enough to be able to irrigate, It took a hell of a lot of work, and it often, your initial plans didn't work out very well. So in this area, in the Bighorn Basin, there was on the Grable River, which is more or less somewhat parallel to the Shoshone, but further south, there was a guy from Omaha who tried to start an irrigation project, and he picked up an old a permit from a couple years before that the state engineer had approved that had not really been put to use. And then he also got a new permit and he also applied for what was called a Carry Act provision, which was an act passed that was sponsored by one of Wyoming's senators in Congress. And the idea of that was that the federal government would reserve lands for a certain purpose for irrigation if the project were supervised and approved by the state engineer. So he had this whole project going, but he wasn't able to meet the time limits in his permits because it's such difficult terrain. And so he had two thoughts when he came to the state engineer's office in the early 1900s, having tried to get this going. He said, I really should be able to claim the priority date of that old permit that I picked up that wasn't used. And I shouldn't really have to meet these permit deadlines. I mean, I've got some people on my property, on the lands, and they need the water. I don't have it all going, but I've got to get it to these people. And the state engineer was not very thrilled with either of those concepts. This was a successor to Meade because Meade's system was famous enough. It was considered a model for the West, although not many Western states adopted all of it, but he had moved on to DC. So this attorney general for the state of Wyoming, who had worked with Meade actually up in the Bighorn Basin, nonetheless said, oh, that old permit, yeah, I think you can claim that date. And because the federal government reserved this land for this project, you don't have to meet state restrictions on the permit. So that actually was overturned by a local court, but the opinion stayed on the books in the attorney general's opinion. And the next project that came up was the big federal project that built what we call Buffalo Bill Dam. It was called the Shoshone Dam at the time. And this image is actually what the engineers for that project, they drew this picture, this image of the dam overshadowing the US Capitol. And that, as it turns out, is a great metaphor for what happened to Wyoming's sense of law and governance of water, was overshadowed by this dam and its project. In this case, the federal government acquired a permit that Buffalo Bill had taken out in 1899, and he had the idea of all this acreage he was going to water, and but he hadn't been able to raise enough money for it, so the feds bought that permit, and then they also took out other permits to build the dam. But they too were quite unable to get their the project done within the time limits for the original permit. And when it got to be 1915, and here we have the original project, the Garland project. Again, people are trying to get water onto this land, and you can see the conditions that people came to, and it was pioneering in 1915. The feds said, well, we see this old attorney general opinion, and we think this land has been reserved for this project. It's an important project. And we don't think we have to comply with the state permit limitations. And the state engineer, partly because of the pressure of these people who are coming to this project, the promise of economic development that it meant for the Bighorn Basin, he complied and extended the permit. And that kept happening. That permit was extended and extended so that the large acreage that had been envisioned under it was slowly filled in as they were able to get water on more and more lands, so that this priority date of 1899 ended up serving more and more lands and therefore requiring more and more water. That permit was not closed out and finally adjudicated and set to the acreage that was actually being watered until this century. until the early 2000s. So that could have made quite a difference on the Shoshone and raised all kinds of problems, except that that river coming from Yellowstone and that big dam that the feds did succeed in building, and you can go see it if you're driving west of Cody, that provided so much water all through the growing season that other people who had later date rights on the Shoshone did okay. And so the state engineer kept extending the permit. Now, meanwhile, in other parts of the state, this is the Wind River, and I can see that I didn't do very well with being able to read this, but it says excavating the Coolidge Canal on the Wind River Indian Reservation. So on the Wind River, the federal government, led by urging from the Wyoming delegation, had worked quite hard on both ensuring that the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes were confined to a reservation on the Wind River, and then at carving back the size of that reservation. And in the last big carving of that reservation in 1904-05, there was the government planned, the federal government planned to offer the land that had once been part of the reservation to settlers and for irrigation. And it took quite a while before anybody could figure out a way to successfully irrigate on that portion. And meanwhile, the Indian people on the reservation were working on building their own canals. That's what this is, with what little money they got from the sales of the land to of the part of the reservation to settlers. They didn't get nearly as much money as was expected, partly because not as many people came. Eventually, the feds took over the project that was meant to serve on what's called the ceded part of the reservation, the part that was to be sold off, and put a lot of money into it and much less help for the Indian irrigation. But, and that permit, similarly, for what's called the Midvale project near Riverton, that permit similarly was extended. It was originally, I think, a 1904 permit. It was extended and extended and extended into the 21st century and was finally closed out a few years ago. But on the Wind River, there's not a big dam upstream that sort of catches more water and shares it out over the system. So as that priority date got more and more lands added under it, and therefore more and more water demand, that put more and more pressure on the whole river. And for people that had come later and had later date rights, they saw increasing demand for serving this 1904 right. Interestingly enough, this concept of, well, if it's federally reserved land, then you don't have to follow state rules, had ricocheted into federal Indian law because, and partly because the same attorney general who came up with this idea in Wyoming had ended up in the U.S. Solicitor's office in about 1907. And he was involved in a famous case out of Montana where the Supreme Court, partly U.S. Supreme Court, partly drawing on his brief, said, you know, these lands have been reserved for this purpose under treaties, and so the tribes have a right to, this is for a reservation in Montana, the tribes have a right to the water in the river with a priority date of their treaty date. And that was to apply, and was applied to reservations all over the country, including Wind River. It was applied a couple of times in the teens and the 20s and then kind of was sleeping, but it raised its head again later, and I will tell you about that as I try to skip through the rest of this. So I want to sort of back off for a minute to say to yourself, well, so, okay, so water, do people really, how can people have rights to it? It's moving, how do we think about this? And because that question is behind what's going on in Wyoming water law and what this guy Elwood Mead was thinking about. If you think about it, water is a very special kind of resource. quite unlike land. And over time, both water users and the state administrators recognize that more and more. It is a resource, of course, in a global sense. There's a hydrologic cycle and you never lose, water is never lost, it's moving in some form. But in a particular source, like a river system, it's very hard to prevent people from accessing and using this resource. But when they use it, it's really easy to deplete. And so how do you govern that? Well, you can think about how there are different kinds of possible rights. You could have the right to access it, to come to a river and get in it or fish. You could have the right to actually use that water, maybe take it someplace else, which is what happens for irrigation diversions in the West. You could have the right to manage when those uses can happen, what seasons and so on. You could have the right to exclude other people from it, and you could have the right to allow or prevent that right to use it from going to anybody else or from going to a different place. So in Wyoming, individuals, it was important to try to get water into private hands to create economic development and the society, but they have only had certain rights to water. They've had access rights and use rights and management rights, depending where they are and how tight water was. But the public through the state keeps the other rights, particularly exclusion. You can be excluded from using water because the state can say, no, we're not going to give you a permit for this. Or they can eliminate your right if you haven't been using it. And there are very strict restrictions on transfers. So I've concluded that really what we have here is a system of community management, which is run by those users who are not all that many people, and the state agency, which is the state engineer's office. Over time, that system has changed a lot, so that not only the sort of changes in permits and avoiding the permit restrictions, which gave people sort of a sense of that they had more private rights to water, but it's been more possible to transfer water rights from one use to another, initially from irrigation to maybe a city or town that was growing. And as the state engineer's office and the board of control, which are the engineer and the superintendents, got experience with that, they eventually figured out how they could, while thinking about interdependence of people and thinking about all the impacts it could have to move a water right, they figured out a way to make that possible and went to the legislature and got their system for that embodied in law. But it came up from the users and the administrators. There's also been challenges that have been met with resistance, and I think some of you will be familiar. The state of Wyoming has provided only pretty narrow protection for keeping water in live streams. It can only be a minimum amount for fish, not for aesthetics, not for recreation, not a sort of varying amount for the different needs fish have in different seasons. It's quite a narrow in-stream flow statute we have. And also, we've tried to force the community on the reservation, a completely different culture, to follow the rules of this community that the rest of us, the settler people, the white people, have created. And so that when I was telling you about the federal Indian law having to do with rights based on a treaty, and young people in the 70s on the reservation raised that issue. They raised an issue about oil companies that were operating on the reservation but not paying full revenues to the tribe that were owed to them. They were basically stealing some of the revenue and some of the oil. And then there was the city of Riverton wanted to drill for groundwater, and these same young guys said, you know, all this water belongs to us under that Supreme Court decision. And the state of Wyoming immediately sued, and they were able to keep it in state court by adjudicating the entire Wind and Bighorn Basin, which is how those old permits that kept getting extended got finally settled. But on the tribes' water, this court recognized that the tribes had the right to most of the water in the Wind River. However, when they tried to put some of that water to use, the water was allocated based on agricultural use, existing irrigation use, and possible future irrigation use. And the tribes, under their own water code, had tried to put had dedicated some of that futures water to in-stream flow in the Wind River, because it got pretty heavily depleted by all the irrigation diversions to non-Indian irrigation projects around Riverton, including Midvale. They got that award, but when they put it to in-stream flow, the state resisted that, and the state court ruled that the tribes couldn't do that. They had to follow Wyoming's law for in-stream flow, which, as I said, was quite narrow. So there was one very eloquent dissent by one state Supreme Court Justice, Michael Golden, who said, you know, in the early 20th century, the big goal was to expropriate Indian lands, and now we seem to think that we should expropriate Indian water, and I'm not going to be party to that, but he was very much in the minority. And that decision held. The tribes didn't appeal it to the US Supreme Court, partly because this kind of litigation is exhausting in time, money, and emotional and political energy, and so it was not appealed. So there's still a lot to be sort of worked out on how that river should run, but there are people who are working on it, including this young guy here you see, Jason Baldus, who is very involved in bringing buffalo to the reservation. His father, Dick Baldus, cared a whole lot and did a lot of research about the Wind River, and there are people working on thinking about that river, and there are new people in all positions along the river and on the reservation, on the irrigation districts nearby, and state government. And so, you know, even this forcing to follow our rules might change. But the point that I wanted to make is that through all this, even when our system has resisted change, underneath it, you have this structure that Meade created, that where you've got the water users and the public, represented by the state, working together. And what he talked about, and the reason I call this book Public Waters, he said he believed fully in the doctrine that public waters should remain a public property, and that to grant private perpetual rights is to sacrifice the welfare of future generations. And if you think about that, it's a lot about this has to change over time, because this resource is what supports us all. And we have to think about how we can best keep it flexible and serve today's needs. So in this century, there are all kinds of things going on. We have technology has gotten to the point where it has changed local hydrology, particularly in places where there's a lot of, say, groundwater use, but also surface water use, where the runoff goes. Climate change is bringing us rain sometimes instead of snow, sometimes not rain, bringing us drought and aridification, which Wyoming is seeing a lot of drought this year. And of course, you know, it's going on all up and down the Colorado River, which Wyoming is a part of, through the Green and Little Snake rivers. There's increasing, steady Wyoming interest in water in live streams for birds, wildlife, fish, aesthetics, and recreation. And there's increasing demand to recognize the human rights of tribal people and defer to those, their rights to resources, culture, and independent governance, rather than having to follow all of our rules. And so, sort of thinking about, I think it's important to know where our water rules came from, how they've changed over time, what the important basis for it is, thinking about this as a public resource, and we have to keep thinking about how it can serve our society now. So the way we manage water has to respond to all these challenges, and I think it can. Wyoming's system, in most ways, has been responsive to change, and it's those rigid responses I mentioned, I think, are going to sort of fade away under the continuing needs that people see for thinking about water and a little differently. So we have to respond to these challenges, and I think we can. Knowing the history, it's very hard to ask people to change if they don't see the change that you're looking for as rooted and connected to needs that they see and also to their own traditions. Because as I say, all these rules grew out of their experience with quite a harsh landscape. And it's clearly going to remain pretty harsh for all of us. But I think Wyoming's system can adapt to that. And the reason I talk about the lessons from Wyoming for the American West is I think if people look into the systems of each of the Western states, particularly the people who are not directly served by the huge federal projects, but are there on the ground with smaller systems, that this understanding of water as a public resource has come through in all those systems and still glimmers through and is what we have to use and rely on and think about now. So thank you. My book, you can find, I've done some other online book events, including discussions with some people who have been involved in different parts of the saga of Wyoming water that I've discussed. You can find those at my website, www.mackinnonwriter.com. And I'd welcome, if we don't get everything discussed today, the questions that you have. If you want to just email me, there's my email address. So thank you. And Nathan, have you fielded any questions?
There we go. Excellent. Thank you. Sorry, I was having a hard time switching back over. So excellent. Thank you so much, Anne. We really appreciate that. We'd like to turn it over to you, our viewers, for any questions that you might have. Again, for those of you watching via Zoom, you could submit your questions using either the chat feature or the Q&A feature. Viewers over on Facebook Live can share your questions in the comment section. So just I wanted to kind of start off, Anne, with a quick question that you alluded to and you mentioned, but I'm really intrigued by your interest in clearly passion in water. And I'm really interested in how that started with this random assignment that you were presented with. And I'm sure that over your career, you've been presented with a lot of kind of out of the blue or pretty random assignments. And I'm just curious, what is it about water and water law that has so clearly stuck with you and become so ingrained in what you do today and resulting in this book?
Well, I guess a quick description is I grew up in Kentucky, and when I got out of college, I worked on some history of the coal fields in Kentucky. And so I was really struck there. I mean, if you think about the Appalachians and what the coal industry did there, and how it transformed the landscape as well as the society, I got very interested in the interaction between natural resources and people. And I came to Wyoming because an old miner in Kentucky had said, the industry's moving west, you got to go see what's going to happen. And it was 1979, and the big mines were opening in Wyoming. So I came and thinking I was covering coal. But, you know, coal does not move. And so when I ended up having to do some water stuff, the fact that it does move and has these connections between people who, like I say, really probably wish they didn't know each other, didn't have to talk to each other. All that, it just got more and more interesting to me, that, and seeing, I mean, all law reflects something about its society. You see that it changes, but with water law, particularly because people in Wyoming do and did regard it as sacred, I just was like, wow, what is this? Plus, Mead is a really good writer. So those old books that George Christopoulos gave me were just, fascinating. So it sort of seemed the most interesting way to think about the society where I was in Wyoming. And I wanted to stay here because Wyoming is small enough in terms of population that you feel like we can maybe have an influence on our fates, which you feel less like you can in a big city somewhere. So I wanted to stay, and water seemed like the thread that would help me understand where I was.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You mentioned research, and I was curious, through your time researching water law and consulting in the area of natural resources, is there anything that comes to mind, again, with this random question, that was really unexpected or surprising when it comes to water and water law in Wyoming?
Hmm. I guess it was really interesting to see how this board created by Mead, which still operates. So it's the Board of Control, the state engineer, and the 4 superintendents of the 4 major water basins. How much they, how close they are, they each live in their individual basin, and when they come together, they handle maybe 150 or more requests for something, changing a head gate, or maybe declaring that a neighbor has abandoned their water right. That's much less common, and also moving water to some new place. And the way they worked through it and thought about it, none of these guys are lawyers, and so it was sort of wonderful to see this thinking going on about, well, who are these people, and are there other interveners, and how is the water going to affect, how's the change in water, if there is a change, how it's going to affect other people. So they had to think about hydrology, also sometimes about personalities. Well, I think actually if we give it a year that they'll change their minds and so on. But that, and I'm sorry, I just lost a train of thought about what I was thinking that was surprising to me. I guess one of the things was that as somebody trying to research it, the board typically it has these discussions, but when they write an order or a decision, it doesn't explain the why of it. It just says, here's the decision. And, or at least that has been the case. That may be changing slightly now. So I found that just like, whoa. So that as a lawyer, you can look up cases by the principles that were involved in them. But these archives, you had to know the name of the stream or the people involved. And so I started keeping my own set of records organized by the issues that appeared in the cases. And so that was really striking. But so I had to spend a lot of time just sort of thumbing through the archives. But the other thing is, because of the prior appropriation system, so it matters a lot when you got your water right, the documentation of these water rights is extremely thorough. So you can find everything about what happened with a particular water right. And so that makes the research quite exciting, because you can find all the original names and the handwriting and everything about it and what happened to it afterwards.
That's fascinating. Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Another question, water is arguably the most important natural resource we rely on. Is demand for water on the landscape and in Wyoming exceeding a sustainable threshold with the increase in human occupancy in the last half century? And what about any predictions for the future?
Um, in places that are maybe, somewhat similar to Wyoming in terms of landscape, where there are more people, the rules have gotten tighter. And but they've also, as people have sought more water for recreation or wildlife, that has been accommodated. So at least at this point, though Wyoming's population has grown, I don't think it's true here that the demands are outstripping the needs. But it depends a lot on I mean, this summer has been pretty interesting in terms of thinking about climate change, and it depends a lot on what we keep seeing happening, and whether we can. One of the things about climate change is it's not all that predictable. I mean, it's sort of the deal. It's chaotic, or at least that's what's, as far as I understand the science, that seems to be the case. So trying to, I think one thing, the state is running out of money from its coal and oil and gas that we used to rely on so much. And a lot of that money was deliberately put into water development. The people in the 80s who made that happen talked about, we're going to take money from a non-renewable resource and put it into a renewable resource, so that a lot of irrigation systems have been updated, some new reservoirs have been built, others have been updated. So we do have a pretty relatively modern infrastructure to rely on, and some of that may prove itself increasingly handy as we're dealing with changing demands. I'm not sure that I am really answering that question because it's a difficult one.
Excellent. We've received a good handful of questions in the Q&A section. So the first one that I'll start with, has the concept of use it or lose it been updated or modified?
Well, the what that is technically called is abandonment. And so, gee, if you haven't used it for 5 years, your neighbor, I'm gonna bring a petition to the Border Control to say you've abandoned it, and then it goes into a big hearing. But the Wyoming Supreme Court since the 30s has made it harder and harder to find abandonment. And I think that's been quite frustrating for Border Control members, because part of what needs to happen, that the reason that somebody like me thought it was important to have deadlines and permits and so on, is that if something didn't work, some great idea didn't work, and now you're not using it anymore, that needs to drop out and the water needs to be available to somebody else. And that's one of the ways that you can serve a changing society. So that if I think the state Supreme Court, starting in the 30s, when some of the early guys who on the court who actually had worked with somebody like Meade and sort of understood the philosophy and the differences between land and water, I think starting in the 30s and onward, the state Supreme Court was more thinking about water like land. Well, I mean, you got a right to it, and you should. We don't like this idea that you could lose it just because you're not using it. We don't do that with land. I mean, we don't like forfeiting of property rights. These are sacred rights. So it's become more and more difficult to abandon water in Wyoming, and in that sense, use it or lose it is still a concept, but it doesn't get applied all that often. Now, the state engineer's office worked pretty hard in the 60s to get official legislative endorsement of the idea that the state engineer could bring an abandonment right, because you can imagine that neighbors don't always want to do that because it creates difficulties between neighbors. He tried that once, and people were so angry at the idea of the state engineer bringing an abandonment cause that it has never been tried again since the 70s. So in that sense, too, the use it or lose it is, so there are a lot of sleeping water rights around, and they can be revived. The Supreme Court has allowed that so that you can have things sort of come to life. And that the one place where that's less true now is the Bighorn Basin, because of that big adjudication that was sparked by it was basin-wide adjudication of all the rights, sparked by the state of Wyoming suing the tribes. They had to keep it in state court, they had to examine every water right in the basin related to the tribes or whoever, and or not. And so they looked into and investigated and checked out every water right, and if it wasn't being used, it was gone. But the rest of the state, there are a lot of sleeping water rights hanging around.
Excellent, great, thank you. Jessica says, thank you very much for your presentation, Anne. Water and mining and much resource extraction are connected in so many ways, but most critically in terms of water pollution. You've discussed Wyoming water law from the position of use, but that implies that all water used and to be used in the future has maintained its usability. In other words, it is not polluted beyond use. Can you talk about what kind of Wyoming water law addresses water pollution?
There's some aspects of the law which talks about how a person who holds a water right has a right to the condition of the water as they initially took out the right to it. But really, Wyoming has observed a chasm between water quality and water quantity, so that and a classic thing that came up on this was with coal bed methane production, in which to get at the gas trapped in coal beds, the companies, and they didn't have to be very well financed because it didn't take a lot of fancy equipment to do this, had to pump the water out to release the gas. And the water was of varying quality, and sometimes it was of okay quality as it came out, but as it then, they just would put it in a dry draw. As it picked up some of the soils, particularly I'm thinking about the Powder River Basin, the quality got worse and worse. And Wyoming the state engineer ended up declaring that production of water for coal bed methane was a beneficial use because it allowed the production of the gas. And then the question of water quality was all controlled by the Department of Environmental Quality, who had to figure out standards and how to deal with that. And I've been in places where the people who are interested in water allocation leave the room when the next speaker comes up to talk about water quality because they regard it as such different things. And clearly, as you point out, those things are much more connected. And ultimately, that declaration that production of water for coal bed methane production as a beneficial use came in somewhat useful, but a number of years later, the state engineer was able to say, well, I can see that there are a lot of these wells that are producing a lot of water, but not much gas, so it's not a beneficial use anymore, so we're going to shut down these wells. But that really wasn't about water quality. So that sort of divide does need to be bridged, and there's evidence showing that the runoff from irrigated fields depending on the quality of the soil, but often on how much fertilizer and stuff was used, then affects the quality of the water. In Torrington, the town has had to go through quite a lot of water treatment to be able to use water that's been affected by the fertilizer that's gone on the fields. So I think that that hasn't been completely addressed, or it's been very little addressed, the connection between the two. And again, I think that Wyoming may have gotten away with that partly because of its low population, as well as the dependence on mining for revenues that has dominated state revenue and politics for at least the past 40 years.
Excellent. Thank you again. Another question, you note that water law continues to change to meet arising needs and issues. Do you ever feel as if the state has strayed far from Meade's original vision of water as a public resource, or is change and adaptation simply a practical necessity?
I think Meade was trying to make the system flexible so that it could change and adapt. I do think that the sense of water as a public resource has persisted, although it's, sometimes been forgotten. I mean, people have tended to think of Wyoming water right as a private property right in all senses that you might own land, and the Wyoming Supreme Court has acted that way. But so I think the change and adaptation is a practical necessity, but that's not counter to the idea of a public resource, of water being a public resource. I think the evidence that that concept is still out there is best seen in the big on the big interstate rivers, the North Platte and the Colorado, where it's become apparent to water users that they really need to rely on the state engineer, and who's often been accompanied by the Water Development Office, to negotiate on issues ranging from endangered species to just conflicting demands for irrigation water, and dealing with the drought in the Southwest and that has been affecting the Colorado River, that individual irrigators couldn't possibly they couldn't protect their water rights without, or protect some reliance on water, even though they may not be able to keep their entire water right, without reliance on the state engineer to represent them and to think about all the needs on the river, which means thinking about it as a public resource. So that's become more and more apparent in the past 25, 30 years, I think. And so that people and it's become more apparent as Wyoming has had to join the rest of the country, both in terms of federal law affecting Wyoming, Endangered Species, Clean Water Act, all those things, and in terms of the connection between our rivers and the rivers that either start here or go through here, and other places. And that also was first recognized on the Colorado in 1922 when the Colorado River Compact was developed. But it hasn't become, and Wyoming has continued to be involved in the Colorado River, but it's become increasingly pressing with climate change causing acidification in the Southwest, and the bathtub rings that you see in Lake Mead and Lake Powell photographs. Only thinking about water as a public resource and the best way to manage it in the current society with current social needs. That's the only way that those issues are going to be addressed, and that we can move forward with water management.
Excellent. Do you still have time for just a few more questions?
I do. I don't know about you guys.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So we've got two that kind of go hand in hand. So I'm going to ask them both and hopefully not complicate them, but I can certainly repeat. So kind of the first part and the bigger question, how do irrigation districts deal or interact with the Bureau of Reclamation regarding water discharge from reservoirs? Can they make demands on water volume? And the second question that kind of specifies a little bit further, for example, the Cody Canal takes its water from the South Fork. The same river flows into the reservoir. Does the reservoir take precedence over the canal because the reservoir is a federal project?
So the federal government had to take out state water rights. So when I'm describing those projects, and the Shoshone project, for instance, the reason they were talking to the state engineer at all was that they had state water permits. And that was the 1902 legislation, which Wyoming's delegation worked hard to promote, that created what became the Bureau of Reclamation, the whole reclamation program. Specifically said that the projects would be subject to state water laws. So, and then as I described, there was some push and pull about how much they would be subject to details like the permit requirements. I mean, excuse me, the time limits within the permits. But they did have to have a permit and have a water right. So the Cody Canal predates, I think I have this right, any of the rights for on the Shoshone for the dam or for what's called direct flow, which would be how the river, what goes through the river, regardless of whether there were a reservoir there. And that direct flow right is the 1899 right, and the dam has a later permit around 1904, I think. I'm getting my early dates a little mixed up, but the Cody Canal has an earlier date, so it has it is not subject to being overridden by the reservoir and to require that water to be stored for users downstream. One thing I might add is that the Buffalo Bill Dam, the Shoshone project, Wyoming has what's called a one fill reservoir rule, which is that a reservoir only gets to fill once. You don't get to keep, you draw it down in mid-July and then something happens and you get to, there's somehow more water due to a big storm or something, and you get to store that water again and fill it all up. You're supposed to just fill it up once, and then that's the amount of water you have to distribute to the people who have rights in that reservoir, which in this case would be the people on the Shoshone project, like Garland and Willwood and the projects there. On the Shoshone, that has not always been fully enforced, but it is more so now, particularly since the dam has been expanded, and so that there's additional rights that to the additional storage that was created. And I guess I didn't say that right, because that storage was created to replace storage that was lost to siltation. But part of because that expansion of the dam was built in the 80s, by that time the U.S. and Wyoming, and particularly the U.S., was very interested in protecting in-stream flows. So there is a requirement that there be a certain amount of water for fish below the dam, so that people can't demand quite the entire amount that's stored in the reservoir the way they might have before. So it's created an interesting sort of new development, which again reflects how the society has changed over time.
Interesting, thank you. One final question. Territorial water rights have been adjudicated for a reasonable amount of water to land, although some rights have not and continue to hold a right to large sum of water to little land. An example of this is the Baldwin Court decrees of Baldwin Creek in the Poposia River Basin. Do you know why or how those decrees were left out or circumnavigated the process of adjudicating rights for a fair proportion of water to land?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, and it's sort of all over the state, but the Baldwin one is a good example. So, so territorial law, as I said, eventually people were expected to and required to file their claims in the county court. And the territorial law provided that if there were a dispute between claimants, they could go to court and fight it out over who really had the earlier right and how much it should be and so on. And so that didn't happen everywhere. It depended on whether there was a dispute. So there are plenty of streams in Wyoming with territorial rights, but there was never a territorial decree because nobody went to court over that stream. This is all before statehood. So if they did go to court and there was a territorial decree, then the state engineer's office was bound by that decree because it had been a court decree and they couldn't overrule it. So so that's what results in what you're calling circumnavigating, because that decree runs the river, and one of the things runs that stream. And one of the things that Meade was really frustrated about, and one reason he wanted to create the Board of Control and do those adjudications on the streams that had not gone to a territorial decree, was that it was really clear that the judges sitting in a territorial court might or may not, and often didn't, know a whole lot about water and ditches, so, and irrigation. So they often, in the same decree, one person gets X water for 100 acres, and another person gets 2X amount of water for 70 acres. I mean, there was no sort of, the examples in the decrees, there's no sort of logic to consistency among how the water was allocated, which drove me totally crazy. And he ended up, there was such a decree, I think it was on Crow Creek in Laramie County, and of course he was in Cheyenne. And he said to the court, well, you know, the irrigators will hang me if I try to enforce this decree the way it's written, because it's so unfair, and inconsistent. And the court judge, this is while he was still the territorial engineer, so before statehood, he was that for 2 years before statehood, because he was working on writing the new laws. And the court said, well, you know, I'll have you put in jail if you don't enforce this decree. So there he was, you know, do I get hung? Do I go to jail? And what he ended up doing was getting all the irrigators together and getting them all to agree to a fairer system of allocation, which used the same method of X CFS per acreage. And eventually he succeeded in doing research, which is why it's 1 CFS per 70 is the standard in the state now. He got them all to agree to a system, and they ran the creek according to that, in spite of the territorial decree. And so he didn't get hung or go to jail. But that was a major reason why he wanted to have this Board of Control superintendents who actually knew something about water and were based in those areas. And his whole point was, you don't have to have a lawyer to come talk to us. This is not a trial. And we were going to adjudicate the entire stream so that it's not, and most of those territorial decrees did cover an entire stream, or at least a tributary to a stream, an entire tributary. But he was concerned that if, which had happened in Colorado, you have an individual, it's like one person against another with no thought about the entire stream and all the other people. And the whole idea was the Board of Control would be thinking, when they did these, they were stream-wide adjudications of the territorial rights, they would be thinking about the whole stream and look at and investigate all and inspect all the uses on the stream. And that's what was upheld by the Wyoming Supreme Court in Buffalo in 1900. But there are a number of those decrees around, and not endless numbers, but they're definitely noticeable, as you've noticed Baldwin Creek. There have been cases, there was a case on Crazy Woman Creek where there was a decree like that, which the Board of Control was finally able to kind of get at because a new dispute came up, 70s, I think. So, yeah, 90 years after the decree, where there was a dispute, there was an abandonment case that somebody brought. And so the Board of Control was able to get in and modify some of the rights because of this abandonment case. But lots of times those decrees just have to be left as they are, or people get convinced to work with each other in another way, the way Meade did on the territorial decree in Laramie County.
And what an incredible question to end on. Not only does it really illustrate the complexity of water and water law in Wyoming, but undoubtedly it demonstrates your incredible interest and knowledge in this topic. So thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to visit with us and to share that knowledge, your experiences, and as I've said, your passion for the work. And thank you again for taking a little bit longer to answer some great questions. Another big thank you to our sponsors, Sage Creek Ranch and the Nancy Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation, for their support of the Draper's Lunchtime Expedition Speaker Series. Just a reminder that this presentation has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you missed anything or would like to share it with someone, you'll be able to find it there. Another reminder as well that you can purchase your own copy of Anne's book, Public Waters, Lessons from Wyoming for the American West, by calling the Center's Points West Market at 1-800-533-3838. Remember too that if you'd like a signed copy, just let them know. Stay tuned for email updates on our upcoming Lunchtime Expedition speakers. If you've registered for the webinar, your email has been added to that list, which you can unsubscribe from at any point in time. If you aren't on that distribution list and would like to be, just let us know and we'll get you added. Again, Anne, it's been a pleasure having you join us today. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. Be well, and we'll see you for the next Draper Lunchtime Expedition.
Thank you all very much.